I still have the $5,000 thank you card my son handed me the day he sold the funeral home I'd poured my life into. A flimsy drugstore card with a cartoon sunset on the front, so thin I almost mistook it for a receipt, and the ink inside was already smudging from the damp of my thumb. What Todd didn't know was that I'd already triggered a state investigation that would cost him his license, and eventually I'd buy that very funeral home out from under him for $40,000 at auction, before turning it into a green burial cooperative where he now mows the memorial meadow under my direct supervision. I'll tell you exactly how I got there. My name is Melinda, and I was 61 years old when my whole world began to crumble in a way I never saw coming. I'd spent 25 years as the embalmer and bookkeeper for Baldwin Family Funeral Services, a modest but respected establishment in a small Ohio river town. My late husband Carl and I had started that funeral home together in the early 90s, buying a derelict Victorian house with 3 stories of sagging floors and a widow's walk that flooded every spring. We converted the parlor into a viewing room, the butler's pantry into a prep suite, and the old carriage house into a refrigerated holding area that could accommodate 6 decedents on rolling stainless steel racks. Carl was the funeral director, the licensed face with the soft voice and impeccable suit. I was the unseen half, the woman in scrubs who spent her days in the embalming room and her nights hunched over a ledger book, tracking every pre-need contract down to the penny. My system was old-fashioned. I used a 12-column bound ledger with acid-free pages, recording each contract's date, the family name, the plot number, the amount collected, the trust deposit date, and the confirmation number from the bank. Every quarter, I reconciled that ledger against the bank statements and the trust account reports until the numbers matched to the cent. When Carl died 7 years ago, our only son Todd inherited the business. I stayed on because Todd had promised me, in writing, that I would retain 50% equity in the company in exchange for my continued labor and the money I'd invested. That promise was why, during the brutal first year of the pandemic, when funerals became drive-through affairs and revenue cratered, I quietly drained my entire $70,000 pension fund into the business account to cover payroll, chemical supplies, and the mortgage on the building. I kept every receipt, every deposit slip, because my working-class upbringing had taught me that trust without documentation was just another word for foolishness. An important detail that would pay off later is this. After a quarter-century in the prep room, I could smell the first faint note of decomposition through 5 layers of plastic and a closed cooler door, a bit of professional instinct that most embalmers develop, but that I had refined to something almost animal. The scent is sweet and cloying, like rotting fruit mixed with a tinny bite of ammonia, and I could detect it when a body sat unembalmed for even a few hours past the safe window. That skill would later prove deadly to my son's scheme. The death that set everything in motion wasn't Carl's, it was his youngest sister, Helen. Aunt Helen lived alone in a bungalow 2 towns over, a small house crammed with ceramic figurines and the smell of lavender sachets. When her heart gave out on a Tuesday morning, I drove over expecting to help sort through a lifetime of photographs and china, to mourn quietly with my son. Instead, I walked into what felt like a liquidation sale. Vanessa, Todd's wife and a real estate agent with a sharp blonde bob and the kind of hard-edged polish that looks good in a headshot but feels like sandpaper in person, was already photographing furniture for an online auction. She had a measuring tape looped around her neck and was talking into her phone about staging and starting bids. Todd was pacing in the kitchen, barking into his own phone about a pending sale that would finally let them upgrade to a country club membership, his voice thin with desperation. Neither of them shed a single tear. I wandered into the little sunroom off the back of the house, a space Helen had used as a reading nook. The windows were fogged with age, and the afternoon light fell dusty across stacks of yellowed gardening magazines. Tucked behind them on the bottom shelf of a bookcase, I spotted a small wooden box, no bigger than a brick, its lid inlaid with a faded marquetry pattern of a mourning dove. The wood was smooth as silk from years of handling, and something about it tugged at me. I lifted the box, felt the weight, and noticed that the bottom was slightly thicker than it should have been. When I ran my nail along the seam, I felt a tiny irregularity, a depression almost invisible. I pressed the corner, and a false panel slid out with a soft click, revealing a thin leather-bound journal. The cover was worn, The pages yellowed at the edges, and the handwriting inside was unmistakably Carl's, that neat, slanted cursive he'd learned in Catholic school. Before I could open it, Todd appeared in the doorway. His eyes flicked to the box, and his expression tightened for just a fraction of a second. He said, "Just old junk, Mom. Toss it in the donate pile or the trash." Then he picked it up from my hands and dropped it into a black plastic garbage bag already full of broken kitchen utensils. I nodded, playing docile, but 30 minutes later, when he and Vanessa were arguing in the front yard about a lawn ornament, I retrieved the bag, slipped the box and the journal into my oversized purse, and left without saying goodbye to anyone. That night, in my tiny apartment above the funeral home's garage, I sat on the edge of my bed with the journal in my lap. Most of it was mundane, notes about weather and inventory, the dates of pre-need seminar presentations that Carl used to give at the senior center. But the final page, written in a shaky script that told me his health had already begun its final downward slide, was different. It read, "I have confirmed the double-sold contracts. Todd is siphoning trust deposits into his own accounts. The pre-need audit is coming, and he will try to pin it on Melinda. Do not trust him. Save yourself. The true shares are in my safety deposit box left untouched deliberately until the time is right. Tell no one." The words blurred as my hands shook. My husband, even from the grave, had seen the monster our son was becoming and had left me a roadmap. Before I continue this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that some betrayals run so deep they require cold, patient justice instead of hot anger. Now, I'll tell you how I played the role of a confused old woman while meticulously dismantling my son's entire scheme. The very next morning, Todd and Vanessa appeared at my door with a carafe of coffee and a stack of papers. Vanessa sat beside me on the sofa, patting my knee like I was a pet. Todd leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and said, "Mom, with Aunt Helen gone, you're all alone now. We want you to come live with us. We have the guest house. We'll take care of everything, all the bills, all the cooking. You won't have to lift a finger again. All we need is for you to sign this simple agreement so we can manage the funeral home and make sure you're provided for." He slid a document across the coffee table. The cover page read, "Caregiver Arrangement and Asset Release." I put on my reading glasses and slowly scanned the dense legal paragraphs, recognizing enough boilerplate to know they were asking me to sign over all my equity interest in Baldwin Family Funeral Services, the very 50% Todd had promised me, in exchange for a vague promise of lifetime care in their guest house. Buried on page 6 was a clause that also granted Todd durable power of attorney, allowing him to sign any future documents on my behalf without my knowledge or consent. The language was slippery, full of wherefores and heretofores, but I'd spent decades parsing insurance policies and trust agreements. They thought I was grief-addled from Helen's loss and exhausted by decades of labor. I let my hand tremble a little as I set the paper down. "I don't understand all this, sweetheart. Can I think about it? I need to look at the business books first, just to understand what my share is worth." Todd's jaw tightened, but Vanessa jumped in with a glossy smile. "Of course, Melinda. Take all the time you need, but we'd love for you to move into the guest house today. Let us pack your things." And so I let them transfer me into their pristine, top-toned home, a house with more square footage than warmth, where I was installed in the guest suite with a view of the koi pond and a subtle slide bolt on the outside of the door that I pretended not to notice. I packed only a small suitcase, but into the lining I tucked Carl's journal, the wooden box, and my old leather mortuary toolkit, a rolled pouch of steel instruments that Vanessa would have recoiled from if she'd known what it held. The first week, I played the part of a foggy, forgetful widow. I shuffled to breakfast in a robe, complained about my knees, and asked the same questions 3 times. Vanessa's patience wore thin quickly. Todd spent hours in his home office on frantic phone calls, and I learned that if I pressed my ear to the vent in my bathroom, the sound carried directly from his study below, every word crystal clear. I heard him snap at a chemical supply company, demanding extended credit terms because the funeral home's operating account was so drained he couldn't afford the premium arterial fluid we'd always used, the Dodge brand that came in concentrated gallons and left tissue firm and lifelike for days. He was buying a cheap, watered-down substitute and charging families for the premium service, something I recognized because he ordered only 4 gallons a month for what should have been 12. I heard him tell Vanessa that the chain acquisition couldn't close until the pre-need liability audit was crystal clean. And I heard him say, once Mom signs the release and the shares are consolidated under my name, Eternal Rest Partners will wire the $1.5 million. We're weeks away. Just keep her comfortable and don't let her near any paperwork. The house was full of small, damning clues I logged in my mind. Vanessa scheduled a consultation with an interior designer for a $40,000 kitchen renovation, flipping through fabric swatches while ignoring a stack of unopened credit card statements on the granite counter. I spotted overdue utility notices wedged behind a copper canister, their pink final notice stamps bright as warning flags. Todd's panic leaked through every interaction. One evening, he slammed down his phone after a call went to voicemail and muttered, "The audit window is closing," before stomping out to the garage. I knew then that the timeline was shorter than I'd hoped, and I needed to gather physical evidence without looking like I was snooping. The opportunity came on a rainy Thursday. A handyman had been scheduled to repair a stuck sliding door in the guest house, but Todd canceled him to save the $90 fee. Vanessa complained loudly about the door, and I saw my chance. I said, "Oh, I can fix that. Carl and I never hired handymen. We did everything ourselves." They both stared at me like I'd announced I could fly. I retrieved my mortuary toolkit from its hiding place in the back of my closet, unrolled the canvas pouch on the bed, and selected a flathead screwdriver and a can of WD-40 from the emergency car kit I'd brought. The toolkit held an array of instruments most people would find gruesome: a curved embalming trocar used for aspiration, a set of aneurysm hooks, a bone saw, and a scalpel. I ignored those and focused on the door. Kneeling on the floor, I gently pried off the plastic cap at the top of the sliding track, squirted lubricant into the roller mechanism, and adjusted the height screw by a quarter turn. Within 5 minutes, the door was gliding silently on its track. Vanessa raised an eyebrow but said nothing. I had revealed a sliver of competence, but they still underestimated me, convincing themselves it was just a lucky old person's trick. That underestimate would be their undoing. That weekend, Todd and Vanessa attended a real estate networking gala, leaving me under the thin supervision of a nanny cam in the main hallway. I knew about the camera because I'd seen the faint red glow of its infrared light at night and recognized the model from a security catalog Carl used to keep. I disabled it by draping a sweater over its mount, claiming I was cold if anyone asked the Alexa device. Then I walked to Todd's home office, a room he kept locked with a cheap quickset knob, the kind you can find at any hardware store. My heart hammered, but my training kicked in. In my mortuary kit, I still had the curved embalming trocar, a hollow, sharpened steel tube about 12 inches long with a lancet tip, used for penetrating the femoral artery and aspirating fluids from a body cavity. The tip is beveled at an angle nearly identical to a slim lockpick, and the hollow shaft provides the perfect amount of flex for tension. I'd used it hundreds of times for its intended purpose, but I'd also once, out of curiosity in the long quiet of a night shift, practiced on a filing cabinet lock after reading a book on locksmithing. I inserted the trocar's point into the keyway, applied a gentle rotational tension with my wrist as if I were opening a stubborn vein, and felt the first pin set with a faint metallic click. Working by touch, I set the remaining 4 pins in sequence, and the lock surrendered in less than 20 seconds. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me. The office smelled of Todd's sharp cologne and the faint ozone of a running computer. The filing cabinet in the corner was unlocked, but it held only innocuous vendor invoices and employee tax forms. I knew Todd well enough to suspect a hidden place. I scanned the room and noticed a credenza behind his desk with a slight gap in the wood grain on one of the drawer fronts, a hairline crack that didn't match the surrounding veneer. I tugged the drawer, but it was false, a fixed panel designed to look like a drawer. Using a fingernail, I pried along the edge and felt a hidden catch release. The bottom of the credenza's interior slid aside, revealing a slim compartment. Inside, I found a folder labeled Melinda Release, and my stomach dropped. The folder contained a notarized copy of a document entitled Irrevocable Release of Equity Interest, dated 3 weeks prior. The signature at the bottom looked exactly like mine at a glance, but the downstroke on the M slanted to the right in a way I never, ever wrote. My capital M always starts with a straight vertical line. Below it was a settlement statement for the sale of Baldwin Family Funeral Services to Eternal Rest Partners for $1.5 million. The buyer's side listed a zero balance for equity payout to Melinda Baldwin, citing the forged release. The entire purchase price was designated to be deposited into Todd Baldwin's personal account at a Florida bank. Next to that was a thick stack of pre-need funeral contracts, each one a colored carbon copy form with a family's name and plot selection. I saw immediately that at least 20 of them listed the identical plot number in the Memorial Garden section, plot G14. That plot had been sold, I counted, 7 different times to 7 different families, each paying between $8,000 and $12,000. The prepaid amounts totaled over $90,000, yet the corresponding trust deposit receipts were missing. In their place were deposit slips into a separate operating account that I recognized as the one Todd used for his own expenses. The routing number was from a credit union out of state. Then, I found a spiral notebook in Todd's handwriting that was effectively a double ledger, a meticulous accounting of which families he'd scammed, which ones hadn't noticed yet, and a projection of how long he could keep the scheme running before the state's required annual pre-need report would expose the missing funds. The notebook had columns for family name, date sold, amount collected, trust deposit Y/N, and alert status. Next to each name was either a green check mark meaning the family was still unaware or a red exclamation point meaning they'd started asking questions. He had circled the date of the upcoming report with a note. Must have mom's SIG on release before audit triggers. I pulled out my phone and photographed every page, taking care to capture the account numbers and the forged signature in sharp focus. Then I replaced everything exactly as I'd found it, slid the false bottom back into place, and slipped out. That night, lying in my guest bed, I opened Carl's journal again and ran my fingers along the spine, feeling a slight bulge. I worked a folded insert free from the binding, a small envelope containing a safety deposit box key and a note in Carl's hand with the box number at a local bank. The note read, "If I'm gone, this is your proof of true ownership. Do not let Todd near it." The next day, I visited that bank, a brick building on Main Street with an ancient vault door that hummed when it swung open. I presented my identification and Helen's death certificate to access the box as a family member, but the teller informed me the box had been held jointly in my name and Carl's all along. I had simply never been told. Inside the box, beneath a stack of savings bonds and Carl's old military discharge papers, was the original stock certificate for Baldwin Family Funeral Services, a cream-colored document with a raised corporate seal. It stated that the business was organized as a close corporation with 2 shareholders, Carl Baldwin and Melinda Baldwin, each holding 50%. When Carl died, his shares passed directly to me by transfer on death registration, a legal maneuver Carl had managed to hide from Todd by keeping the corporate records exclusively in this box and never filing the updated registration with the state board, in a way Todd could easily access through routine searches. Legally, I had been the sole owner of the funeral home for the past 7 years, and Todd had been operating as my licensed manager, not the proprietor. He had no right to sell a single asset. The realization hit me like ice water. I was the landowner, the equity holder, the person on the title. Todd was merely an employee with a stolen key to the kingdom. I now had my proof, but I needed an ally inside the system. I had noticed, tucked into the journal, a small directory of contacts Carl had kept, including a name and direct number for Mrs. Eloise Grant, the compliance officer at the regional bank that held the pre-need trust accounts. I called her from a payphone outside a laundromat, intentionally not using my cell phone, and arranged a meeting. Mrs. Grant was a severe, efficient woman in her 50s with silver reading glasses on a chain and a no-nonsense manner. Her office smelled of old paper and floor wax. I sat down and laid out the double-sold contracts, the forged release, and the stock certificate. She listened without interruption, her eyes flicking over each document with the speed of someone who'd spent decades in regulatory enforcement. Then she leaned forward and whispered, "I have been suspecting irregularities for months. Every quarter I request the trust reconciliation, and Todd sends me doctored statements that don't match the bank's internal records. The pre-need trust rule under Ohio Revised Code 4717 requires that 100% of all monies received from pre-need funeral contracts must be deposited into a trust within 30 days and cannot be withdrawn until the funeral is performed. Failure to do so is considered embezzlement. I've already initiated an internal investigation, but I need direct access to his QuickBooks files to prove the systematic diversion and to link the missing funds to his personal accounts. If you can obtain those files, I can escalate to the Department of Insurance and the funeral director's licensing board within days. She handed me a small USB drive, ordinary looking except for a tiny silver logo that said QB Forensics. She explained it was a preloaded script that, once inserted, would silently copy the entire QuickBooks company file, all associated database files, and the audit trail log onto the drive without leaving any visible trace. All I had to do was plug it in, wait for the light to stop blinking, and remove it. I waited until the next time Todd and Vanessa were out, a Sunday afternoon when they'd taken a drive to an open house. I again disabled the hallway camera with my sweater trick and entered Todd's office. This time, his computer was on but password protected. I knew Todd. He had used the same password since high school, his son's birth date backward, a string of digits starting with the year. I typed it in, and the desktop bloomed open. I inserted the USB and watched the drive light flicker for about 4 minutes, the silence of the room broken only by the hum of the computer's fan. While the script ran, I navigated into QuickBooks, my old familiar terrain, and opened the audit log. The built-in record showed that dozens of pre-need trust deposits had been voided after posting, then re-entered as payments to a vendor called Baldwin Management. A quick cross-check with the chart of accounts revealed that Baldwin Management was simply Todd's personal checking account at the credit union. The total siphoned over 3 years was just over $412,000. I also searched his email and found an exchange with a representative from Eternal Rest Partners discussing the need to clean up the pre-need liability issue before closing, and Todd's reply: "I'll handle the family issue within the week. Mom is old and won't fight it." I saved a screenshot into the documents folder so the USB script would capture it. The drive light stopped blinking, and I removed it, closed everything, and returned to my room. That evening, I met Mrs. Grant at a diner far from town, a place with cracked vinyl booths and the smell of frying onions. I handed her the USB drive, and she plugged it into her own laptop right there, scrolling through the files with satisfaction. She told me the board investigator would be ready in 2 days, and she would coordinate the visit to coincide with the scheduled sale closing at the funeral home. But before that, I needed to test one final thing. I needed to know if any shred of Todd remained that wasn't pure predation, so I staged a medical scare. The following afternoon, I was sitting in their expansive living room with Todd and Vanessa, pretending to watch a home renovation show. Vanessa had a binder of paint swatches open on her lap, and Todd was typing furiously on his laptop. I suddenly clutched my chest, made a strangling gasp, and crumpled sideways onto the carpet, keeping my eyes half closed but my senses sharp. The room went quiet for a beat. I heard Vanessa say, "Oh my God, is she having a heart attack?" Todd didn't move toward me. Instead, I felt the vibration of his footsteps through the floor and a draft as he stepped right over my body, his shoe brushing my hip. He snatched his laptop from the coffee table, and his voice was flat and irritated. "Not now, Mom. I have to finish this contract before 5. He walked out of the room, and I lay there, my pulse pounding but my soul going perfectly still. After a minute, Vanessa nudged me with her foot and asked, "Are you okay or what?" I came to life, coughing and groaning, and they both regarded me with a mixture of annoyance and relief, but neither of them ever called 911. That was the moment I knew every natural bond was dead, and I could proceed with the kind of surgical ruthlessness that my mortuary training had equipped me for. 2 days later, Todd announced that we were going to the funeral home for a small paperwork session. Vanessa drove, Todd in the passenger seat, me in the back like luggage. As we pulled into the familiar gravel lot, I saw that the building looked the same, the Victorian eaves weathered but dignified. But a black sedan with state plates was parked discreetly around the side, which Todd didn't notice because his eyes were on his phone. We walked into the main arrangement office, a room I'd spent decades in, with its walnut paneling and the faint, ever-present smell of formaldehyde wrapped in lemon disinfectant. Seated at the conference table was a smooth-faced man in a gray suit, a representative from Eternal Rest Partners, and beside him a bank official I didn't recognize. Todd had set the entire closing here, thinking my presence would be the final signature. The documents were spread across the table, the sale agreement, the forged release, the transfer of deed, all flagged with yellow stickies where my name waited. Todd pushed a heavy gold-plated pen into my hand and pointed at a flagged line on the release agreement. "Just sign right there, Mom. That's all. Then you can go home and rest." He smiled, the charmer's smile that had won over funeral families for a decade, but his eyes were cold and desperate. I looked at the document, then at him, and I said in a voice so calm it surprised even me, "I'm not signing a document that seals my own theft, and I'm not your cover anymore." For a beat, there was absolute silence, the kind that presses on your eardrums. Then the bank official stood up and nodded toward the door. It opened, and in walked Mrs. Eloise Grant alongside two grim-faced investigators from the Ohio State Board of Embalmers and Funeral Directors, their badges visible on lanyards. The lead investigator, a man with a close-cropped silver beard named Agent Carter, said, "Todd Baldwin, this office is being placed under immediate suspension pending investigation into over 80 counts of pre-need fraud, forgery, and misappropriation of trust assets. We have a warrant for all financial and operational records." Todd's face went white, then red, and he started shouting, jabbing a finger at me and yelling that I was senile and confused. But the representative from Eternal Rest Partners was already sliding his documents back into his briefcase and saying, "This deal is dead. We were contacted by the compliance officer this morning." Vanessa screamed that I was a bitter old witch, but an officer was already reading her rights for conspiracy. Another officer guided me gently out of the room while Todd was handcuffed. I simply stood in the hallway, still holding the pen, and let the tide I'd set in motion wash over them all. The state investigation took 4 months. Auditors uncovered every double-sold contract, every fake embalming report, the forged release, and the intricate maze of accounts Todd had used to fund 2 years of vacations, a boat, and Vanessa's luxury spending. The prep room, when they inspected it, still contained a body that I had noticed on one of my earlier visits, an elderly woman named Mrs. Patterson, whose family had paid for a premium embalming and cosmetic viewing. I had detected the faint, sweet ammonia tang through the cooler door, and when the state examiners opened the body bag, they found her orbit soft and leaking fluid, her tissues already slipping into active decay because Todd had used the cheap, watered-down arterial solution I'd heard him order. The family filed a civil suit that added to the criminal charges. Todd's funeral director license was permanently revoked. He was convicted on 8 felony counts of financial fraud and 1 count of forgery, receiving a sentence of 5 years in state prison. Vanessa divorced him the week after the conviction, attempting to claim innocence, but banking records showed her direct knowledge of the pre-need diversions and her own spending of the stolen money. She pled to a lesser charge of conspiracy, receiving 3 years of probation and a lifetime ban from any fiduciary or funeral industry role. The funeral home itself, now tainted by scandal and with no licensed director, went into court-ordered receivership. Because the pre-need trust had been so thoroughly looted, the court ordered a liquidation auction of all business operating assets to provide restitution to the defrauded families. My shares, however, were protected. The original stock certificate Carl had hidden proved that the building and land were legally mine, free and clear of Todd's encumbrances. Only the business assets, the embalming equipment, the fleet of hearses, the furniture, and the goodwill were seized. The auction was held on a cold January morning in a warehouse across town, a place smelling of dust and old motor oil. I stood in the back with a cashier's check for $40,000 that I had scraped together from Helen's small inheritance and a part-time bookkeeping job I'd taken to rebuild my savings. The bidding started at $5,000 for the lot. Most bidders were funeral chains or liquidators, but they pulled back when the auctioneer announced that the assets were being sold subject to a restricted trust claim and that any purchaser must assume liability for pending consumer complaints. I raised my paddle calmly at $40,000, and when the gavel fell, I became the owner of every embalming table, every makeup kit, every casket display model, and every file cabinet. I didn't need the old business model. I had a different vision. I spent the next 6 months converting the building into a green burial cooperative. I donated the embalming tables to a mortuary science school in Columbus. I ripped out the viewing rooms and replaced them with a bright, plant-filled welcome center where families could plan natural burials. No embalming chemicals, no steel vaults, just biodegradable shrouds woven from undyed cotton and shallow graves in a wildflower meadow that I planted on the 2 acres behind the building. I called it Meadows Rest. The prep room became a workshop for building woven willow coffins, and the old formaldehyde-laced air was purged and replaced by the scent of drying lavender and fresh-cut grass. I hired 2 young horticulturists and a grief counselor, and we opened our doors to a community that had grown tired of funeral industry excess. The first family that chose a green burial, there planted a dogwood sapling over their mother's grave, and I stood with them in the soft rain and felt something like peace return. Todd was released on parole after 2 years, his arrogance worn down to a raw kind of bafflement. I had been watching his case, and I knew he had no job prospects, no money, and no one left who would take him in. I wrote him a single letter offering him a job. When he showed up at my door, older, thinner, his expensive polo shirt hanging loose on his frame, I handed him a push mower and a pair of work gloves. I said, "The memorial meadow needs mowing every week. You'll do it under my supervision, and you'll be paid minimum wage. You'll look at the grass, not at me. If you do a good job, maybe the families in this community will one day forget what you did. But I never will." He opened his mouth, then closed it. Now, every Thursday morning, I sit on the back deck with my coffee and watch him push that mower in slow, careful lines across a field that was once his empire, the blades humming over the same soil where he buried so many lies. Carl's warning saved me, but Carl had also known me well enough to trust that I would find the strength to act. He was right. Have you ever discovered a dark secret about someone you trusted completely? How did you handle it? If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs a reminder that some wounds demand cold, quiet justice, not noise. I'll see you in the next story.